The clock on the kitchen wall had never once told the right time. Harry had noticed this early in his first visit to the Burrow, years ago now, when the world had still felt large and strange and full of things that could be explained if you simply asked the right person. The clock had 9 hands, each one bearing a name: Molly, Arthur, Bill, Charlie, Percy, Fred, George, Ron, Ginny, and each hand pointed not to hours or minutes, but to places and conditions: home, school, work, traveling, lost, mortal peril. It was the most honest clock Harry had ever encountered, and also the most quietly terrifying, because it never pretended that the world was simpler than it was. Tonight, all 9 hands pointed to home. Harry sat at the kitchen table with a mug of tea going cold beside him and watched the clock the way he had been watching everything lately, carefully waiting for something to shift. Outside, the July evening was warm and unhurried, the kind that smelled of cut grass and coming rain, the kind that felt, from the inside of a well-lit kitchen, like nothing could possibly be wrong. Somewhere upstairs, Ron was winning an argument with himself about Quidditch statistics. Fred and George were in the living room, speaking in the low, conspiratorial murmur they used when they were either planning something brilliant or something catastrophic, which in their case was frequently the same thing. Ginny was at the far end of the kitchen table, reading, her red hair falling forward over the page, and Molly Weasley was at the stove. This was, Harry had come to understand, her natural position in the universe, not because she had no other place to be, but because she had chosen this one, deliberately and completely, the way some people chose a faith. She stood with her back to the room, stirring something that smelled of rosemary and something else Harry couldn't name, her wand tucked into her apron pocket, her shoulders set in that particular way that meant she was thinking more than she was cooking. It was a Tuesday. Arthur was at the ministry. The order had met 3 days ago, and Harry had not been told what was discussed, which meant it was either nothing significant or something they had decided he should not know. And the uncertainty between those two possibilities had been sitting in his chest like a stone since Sunday. He picked up his mug, found it cold, and set it down again. "You've been staring at that clock for 20 minutes, Ginny said, without looking up from her book. "I wasn't staring." "You were. You do it when you're trying to work something out." She turned a page. "Has it told you anything useful?" "All 9 hands say home." "Then we're all home." She said it simply, as though that settled something. Perhaps for her it did. Harry looked back at the clock. All 9 hands, pointing steadily. He knew, in a reasonable and rational part of his mind, that this was good. That home was better than traveling or lost, and incomparably better than the one that sometimes made Molly go very still when she looked at it. He knew this, and yet. The evening light came through the kitchen window at a low angle, turning everything amber and slightly unreal, the way summer evenings did just before they tipped into dusk. The enchantments on the Burrow were not visible, of course. That was the nature of protective magic, that it worked precisely because you could not see it working. But Harry had come to feel them, in the way you felt central heating in a house or the specific silence of a room that had been recently occupied. The Burrow had a hum to it, not loud, not constant, just present, the way a low note held on a piano eventually becomes indistinguishable from silence until it stops. He was thinking about this, about the hum, about how you only really noticed it when the light flickered. Not dramatically, not the way lights flickered in films, all at once, casting everything into darkness before recovering with a dramatic flourish. It was quieter than that. A single pulse, barely perceptible, as though someone had exhaled against a candle from 2 rooms away. The kitchen light, the 3 mismatched lamps, the warm glow above the stove, all of them dimmed together for perhaps half a second, and then returned to normal. Harry's hands went still around his mug. Ginny had looked up, and Molly had turned around. That was the thing Harry would think about later, in the long, careful hours of that night. Not the flicker itself, which could have been anything. A surge, a fault, some perfectly ordinary magical fluctuation in an old and eccentric house. No, what Harry would think about was Molly's face in the moment she turned. It lasted less than 2 seconds. He was certain of this because he had been watching the clock, had been watching her, had been doing what Ginny said he did when he was trying to work something out. And in those 2 seconds, before Molly smoothed her expression into something calm and faintly amused, he saw something pass through her face that he recognized because he had seen it in mirrors. It was not panic. Molly Weasley was not a woman who panicked easily, and Harry knew this in his bones, had known it since the night in the Department of Mysteries when she had faced Bellatrix Lestrange with a fury so cold and absolute it had felt almost impersonal. No, what he saw was not panic. It was recognition, as though the flicker had said something to her in a language she already knew, and the message had been exactly what she had been waiting and dreading to receive. Then she smiled. "Probably just the gnomes again," she said, turning back to the stove. "They got into the east wall last month, and Arthur still hasn't properly. Yes, I'm certain that's all it is." She said this last part to herself, or to the pot, in the tone of someone who was actively constructing certainty rather than reporting it. "Ginny, love, will you call Fred and George in for supper? I expect Ron's still upstairs." Ginny was already looking at Harry. He looked back at her. She raised her eyebrows very slightly, a question so small it barely qualified as one, and he gave a fraction of a shrug in response, which he hoped communicated "I don't know," without communicating the full weight of "I saw her face, and I don't think it's the gnomes." "Fred! George!" Ginny called, stepping into the hallway. "Mum says supper." The house responded to this the way it always did, with noise, with motion, with the particular chaos of too many people navigating too small a space, with too much confidence. Fred and George came in from the living room, debating something in loud, overlapping voices. Ron appeared at the top of the stairs and descended them with the velocity of someone who had been waiting for this announcement for some time. The kitchen filled with warmth and argument and the smell of Molly's cooking, and everything was, on its surface, exactly as it always was. Harry sat in the middle of it and watched Molly's back. She did not look at the window. This was a thing he noticed because it was a thing she was clearly and deliberately not doing, keeping her eyes on the stove, on the bowls she was setting out, on Fred's elbow which was threatening the good jug, all with the precise attentiveness of someone maintaining focus somewhere specific so that it would not drift somewhere else. The window above the sink faced east, the east wall, she had said, where the gnomes had got in. Stop it, Harry told himself. She said it was fine, but he had seen her face. Supper was loud and ordinary and good. Fred recounted with considerable embellishment a mishap at the shop involving a skiving snack box and an unsuspecting owl. George provided factual corrections to every third sentence, which Fred ignored entirely. Ron ate with the focused intensity he brought to most things he genuinely enjoyed. Ginny laughed at the right moments and said little. Molly refilled bowls without being asked and smiled at the right moments and said the right things, and Harry watched all of it with one part of his attention and used the rest to think about the flicker and Molly's face and the hum of the enchantments that he could no longer, now that he was listening for it, clearly hear. Was it still there? Had it been there before supper? He was not sure. He had grown accustomed to it without ever consciously noting it, which meant he had no baseline, no point of comparison. The hum of safety, the sound of protection working as it should. How did you measure the presence of something you had never thought to measure? Harry, eat something, Molly said, without looking at him. He ate something. After supper, while the twins were doing the washing up with wands and competitive commentary, Harry stepped out the back door into the garden. The evening had settled into that particular post-dusk grey that wasn't quite dark, the sky a deep, uncertain blue above the hills, the air cooling fast. He stood on the step and listened. Frogs, somewhere. Wind through the long grass at the garden's edge. A late bird, brief and far away. And nothing else. No hum. No low, steady note beneath the ordinary sounds of the evening. Just the garden. Just the darkening sky. Just the silence that lived between things. Harry stood very still and thought, that's new. He didn't know if he was right. He couldn't be certain. He was not an expert in protective enchantments, had never studied them in any systematic way, and it was entirely possible that what he was feeling, or rather, what he was not feeling, was simply the result of paying attention to something he normally ignored, the way a word looked wrong once you stared at it too long. But Molly had turned around. Molly had seen her face go through that 2-second calculation and had chosen to smooth it down into probably just the gnomes. He could go inside and say nothing. Supper was done. Fred and George were laughing about something. Ron would want to play chess. Ginny would finish her book. And the evening would continue. And perhaps the hum would come back. Or perhaps it had never gone anywhere. And by morning, it would all be nothing worth mentioning. He could go inside and say nothing. He stood in the cooling garden and turned this option over, examining it carefully. The way you examine something that looked whole, but that you suspected, with a low and persistent unease, might not be. He was still standing there when the kitchen light flickered again. This time, it did not come back. The second flicker was different from the first. The first had been a hesitation, the kind of thing you could, if you chose to, attribute to old wiring or wandering gnomes, or the general structural eccentricity of a house that had been magically extended so many times that no one, including Arthur Weasley, could say with complete confidence how many rooms it actually contained. The first flicker had lasted half a second and could be explained away, and Molly had explained it away, and Harry had almost let her. The second flicker lasted 3 seconds, and then it stopped being a flicker entirely. The kitchen light went out. The 3 mismatched lamps went out. the warm amber glow above the stove, the one that Harry associated in some wordless and fundamental way with the idea of safe, went out, and with them went something else, something that had no light to lose because it had never been visible in the first place, but whose absence Harry felt the moment it happened, the way you felt a door close in a room you couldn't see. The hum stopped, not gradually, not fading the way a sound fades when its source moves away. It simply ceased between one breath and the next, and the silence that replaced it was a different kind of silence than the garden silence he had been standing in a moment before. That had been an ordinary silence, full of frogs and wind. This was the silence of something held back, something waiting. Harry stepped back inside. The kitchen was dark, except for the last grey light coming through the windows, and in that light he could see Molly standing very still beside the stove, her right hand already at her apron pocket where her wand was. She was not reaching for it. She was simply placing her hand near it, the way you placed a hand near something you might need quickly without wanting to acknowledge, yet that you might need it quickly. Fred and George had stopped laughing. This, more than the darkness, more than the silence, was what told Harry the situation was real. Fred and George Weasley did not stop laughing easily. They had laughed at OWL results. They had laughed once when a filibuster firework had gone off inside George's left trouser pocket. The cessation of their laughter in a dark kitchen on a July evening was a data point that Harry's body understood before his mind caught up with it, and his right hand moved to his own wand, almost without instruction. "Mum," George said. His voice was different, not frightened. Fred and George did not do frightened, or if they did, they had so thoroughly buried the machinery for it that it had become inaccessible even to themselves, but different, lower, the voice of someone who had set aside one version of himself and picked up another. "I know," Molly said, 2 words, entirely calm, and then, "Everyone in the kitchen. Now, please." The please was what got Ron down the stairs in under 4 seconds. Harry had observed over the years that Molly's pleas operated on a register that her family heard differently than anyone else, not as politeness, but as its precise opposite, as the word she used when politeness was the last thing on her mind, and what she actually meant was immediately and without argument. Ron appeared at the kitchen door in socks, his chess piece still in his hand, and took in the dark room and his mother's posture and his brother's faces, and set the chess piece down on the counter with a small, deliberate click. Ginny was already there. Harry didn't know when she had moved. He had been watching Molly, watching the twins, but Ginny was standing at the kitchen table with her wand out, not raised, just out. The way she held it was not dramatic. It was familiar, the grip of someone who had carried a wand in difficult moments before and knew that the point was not to look ready, but to be ready, which were 2 entirely different things. Harry thought, involuntarily, of the chamber, of a 12-year-old girl who had been through something he couldn't fully imagine, and who had come out of it with that particular quality of stillness she carried now. Not the stillness of someone who wasn't afraid, but the stillness of someone who had decided that fear was a piece of information rather than a directive. "Sit down, all of you," Molly said. She was moving. To the windows now, not quickly, but with the deliberate economy of someone following a plan they had made long before tonight and hoped never to use. She drew the curtains, both windows. The grey evening light vanished entirely, and the kitchen became very dark and very close. "Mum," Fred said. "What?" "Sit down." They sat down. Molly lit a single candle on the table. One. Not enough to be seen from outside, Harry realized. One candle at the center of a curtained kitchen threw light on faces and left the windows dark, which meant that from outside there was nothing to see. No glow, no sign of occupation. It was exactly the right amount of light for exactly the right reason. And Harry looked at Molly across the candle flame and understood that she had thought about this, had thought about exactly this, not this specific evening, not this particular failure of enchantments, but the category of thing it represented, the shape of the threat, and what you did when it arrived. She sat down at the head of the table. She folded her hands in front of her. She looked at each of them in turn, Fred, George, Ron, Ginny, and then Harry, where her gaze settled for a fraction of a second longer than the others, not accusingly, not with any particular message, just longer. And then she said, in a voice that was entirely steady, "The protective enchantments have gone down, all of them, I think. Your father is aware. I sent a Patronus before I came to sit down. He's on his way." The candle flame did not move. Outside, the frogs continued. The wind continued. "How long?" Ginny asked. "I don't know." "Is it them?" Ron asked. Molly was quiet for a moment. In the candlelight, her face was composed in a way that Harry associated with great and practiced effort. "I don't know that either," she said. "It may be proximity. It may be something more direct. The enchantments on this house are layered. Some of them are Dumbledore's, and those don't simply fail without reason. But they can be suppressed, temporarily, if something is close enough." The word "something" did a great deal of work in that sentence, and everyone at the table understood exactly what category of thing it referred to, and no one said it aloud, because this was the Weasley family's particular discipline in difficult moments. You named the shape of the danger without naming the danger itself, because naming it made it larger, and what you needed right now was for it to stay the size it was. Harry's hands were flat on the table. He was thinking. He was thinking about what Molly had just said. Dumbledore's enchantments don't simply fail without reason. And he was thinking about what he knew, which was not nothing. He knew about Voldemort's methods. He knew about the way Death Eaters moved, the way they tested the edges of protective magic before they committed to anything, the way a temporary suppression was sometimes not an attack, but a question. Is anyone home? And how well are they protected? And is tonight the right night? He had heard this explained in order meetings he was not supposed to have overheard, standing on the stairs at Grimmauld Place with Ron, both of them breathing shallowly, listening to Moody's voice from behind a closed door. He knew things, in other words, that the others at this table might not know, or might know less completely, and the question that had arrived fully formed in the moment the lights went out and had not left him since, was what to do with that. He could say nothing. Molly had the situation in hand. Arthur was coming. The right people had been informed, saying what he suspected, that this felt deliberate, that a temporary suppression of this kind was a specific tactic, that the silence outside was the particular silence of something that had not yet decided. would add fear to the room without adding any practical capacity to deal with what they were afraid of. It might be wrong. It was, at minimum, speculative. And Molly was clearly operating from her own significant knowledge of the situation. So perhaps she already knew. Perhaps she had already made the same calculation and arrived at the same conclusion, and chosen not to voice it for exactly the reasons he was now considering not voicing it. Or perhaps she hadn't. Perhaps she knew the enchantments had failed, but not why. Not with the specificity he had. Perhaps the difference between proximity and deliberate suppression was not academic tonight. He looked at Molly. She was watching Fred and George with an expression he had come to recognize, the one she used when she was counting heads, confirming presences, the expression of a woman whose fundamental orientation toward the world was, "Are my people accounted for?" and who would answer every other question only after that one was resolved. Fred said, with a lightness so carefully constructed, it was almost its own kind of courage. "Well, this is cozy, tremendously cozy," George agreed. "I feel we should do this more often, perhaps make it a Tuesday tradition." "It is Tuesday," Ron said. "See? Already a tradition." Ginny made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. Molly's expression softened by a degree so slight that Harry almost missed it, and he understood then what Fred and George were doing and why they were doing it, and felt something complicated move through him. Admiration, and something sadder than admiration, and the recognition that performing calm for someone you loved was its own form of courage, quiet and unspectacular and entirely invisible unless you knew to look for it. He looked down at his hands on the table. Outside, the garden was silent. The frogs had stopped. Harry became aware of this gradually, the way you became aware of a sound stopping rather than starting, the absence registering only once the brain had had a moment to confirm that yes, the thing that had been there was no longer there. The frogs had been continuous since supper, that reliable summer sound, and now they were not. The wind had dropped. The single late bird had long since found wherever it was going. The garden was completely, totally, carefully quiet in the way that things were quiet when something nearby had made them quiet. He did not move. He did not look at the curtained window. He kept his eyes on the candle flame and thought very precisely and very carefully about what he knew. Proximity, Molly had said, if something is close enough. He thought about Moody's voice from behind the closed door at Grimmauld Place. He thought about the particular stillness of the garden. "Mum," he said. His voice came out quieter than he intended, which was perhaps appropriate. Everyone looked at him. Molly looked at him. "I think—" He stopped, started again. "At the order meetings, I wasn't supposed to, but I heard Moody talking about how this kind of thing works. The enchantments going down like this, all at once quickly. He said that was different from a gradual failure. He said that it meant something nearby was actively—" "Harry," Molly said. He stopped. She looked at him for a moment. The candlelight moved across her face, and he could not read her expression with complete certainty. Could read the steadiness of it, the control, but not what was underneath the steadiness, not precisely. "I know," she said. 2 words again. The same 2 words she had said to George in the dark before the candle was lit, and Harry understood, with a clarity that landed somewhere between relief and something heavier. that she had known before he said it, had known, he suspected, before the lights went out entirely, had known in the way that people who had been living with a particular threat for a particular length of time developed a sense for its specific textures, the way experienced sailors knew the difference between weather types from the quality of the air. She had known, and she had lit one candle, and she had sent a Patronus to Arthur, and she had sat her family down around a table, and she had not told them, and Harry looked at her across the candlelight and tried to work out whether her not telling them was the same kind of decision he had been circling, or something different, something that came from a longer and more specific knowledge of what these 5 people could carry and what it was kinda not to make them carry until they had to. "Dad's coming," Ron said. Not a question, holding on to it. "Yes," Molly said. "He's coming." Fred and George exchanged a look across the table, brief and unreadable and very fast, the private language of people who had grown up side by side and no longer needed full sentences. Then Fred leaned back in his chair with a studied casualness that convinced no one entirely and said, "Right then, while we wait. Someone want to tell us why Ron still thinks the Chudley Cannons have a realistic shot at the league title? Because I think that's the conversation this evening actually needs." Ron said, They don't," George said. And just like that, or nearly just like that, the kitchen was doing the thing it did, filling itself up with the ordinary noise of people who loved each other enough to perform normalcy in the dark. Molly's hands, Harry noticed, were no longer folded on the table. One of them had moved to her wand, resting lightly, barely touching, a hand making a promise to itself. Ginny caught his eye from across the table. She looked at him steadily for a moment, her wand lying on the table beside her like a matter of fact, and then she looked at the curtained window and then back at him, and her expression said clearly and without drama, "Yes, I hear it too. The frogs have stopped." Harry nodded once. She nodded back. Outside, the garden held its silence like a secret, and the night, which had not yet decided what it was going to be, continued to wait. The candle had burned down perhaps 1/4 of an inch. Harry knew this because he had been watching it, not consciously, not with any particular intention, but in the way you watched something small and measurable when the larger things around you were neither small nor measurable, and you needed somewhere to rest your eyes that wasn't a curtained window or a door or the face of someone you were responsible for. The candle was neutral. The candle was just burning, doing the uncomplicated thing it had always done, indifferent to enchantments and garden silences and the specific quality of a July night that had decided to become something other than ordinary. Ron and George were still arguing about the cannons, or rather Ron was still arguing and George was providing the kind of responses that were technically engagement but were actually closer to entertainment, agreeing with Ron on minor points purely in order to disagree more comprehensively on the major ones. Watching Ron's face with the quiet satisfaction of someone conducting an experiment they already knew the result of. Fred had contributed 3 opinions and was now sitting with his chin in his hand, looking at nothing in particular, and Harry recognized this posture because he had seen it before. In the moments between Fred's performances, the brief intervals when Fred Weasley set down the version of himself that the room required and was just Fred. thinking about something he wasn't saying. Ginny had gone back to her book, or had opened her book. Harry wasn't certain she was reading it. Molly was making tea. No one had asked for tea. This was not the point of the tea, and everyone at the table understood this, and no one said so. The tea was something for Molly's hands to do, and for the kettle's whistle to mark the time, and for the small, reliable sequence of cup and saucer and spoon to assert that certain ordinary things were still occurring in an ordinary way, which was its own form of argument against the silence outside. Harry watched the candle and thought. He had been thinking the same thought, more or less, since the lights went out, turning it over and examining it from different angles, the way you turned over a stone you weren't sure you wanted to look under. The thought was this: they are here because of me. Not they, necessarily. Not certainly. Molly had said proximity, had said she didn't know if it was deliberate, and Arthur was coming, and perhaps when he arrived, he would have information that reframed the evening entirely, would say it was a ministry drill or a fault in the local ley lines or something that had nothing to do with Harry at all. This was possible. Harry acknowledged it was possible, but he had been living inside this particular truth for long enough now that he had developed a kind of instinct for it, the way you developed an instinct for weather if you spent enough time outside. Not certainty, but a reading of conditions, a pattern, recognition that operated below the level of conscious thought. And the conditions tonight, the deliberate suppression, the specific silence of the garden, the fact that it was the Burrow, this house, this family, read the way they read because of him. He was the reason the Burrow had enchantments on it at all. He knew this. He had known it since his second summer here, had felt it then as a kind of warmth, that this family had taken him in, and that the magical world's most powerful protections had been extended around him and around them because of that, and had not, perhaps, allowed himself to fully think through what that meant. What it meant in the other direction. That the enchantments existed because of him, yes, but that the need for the enchantments existed because of him. That this house was a target, had always been a potential target, had become more of one every year, because Arthur Weasley worked for the Order, and because Dumbledore trusted him, and because Harry Potter ate supper at this kitchen table every summer and slept in Ron's room, and had, in some way he had never asked for and could not give back, made this family part of the shape of his life and made himself part of theirs. The Weasleys were in danger tonight because of him. He looked at Ron, who was saying something about the Canon's seeker with the wholehearted conviction of someone who had not yet been sufficiently contradicted. Ron, who had been his friend since a train compartment when they were 11, who had chosen him without knowing what that choice would eventually require. He looked at Fred, who was still sitting with his chin in his hand, still thinking whatever private thing he was thinking. He looked at George, who was listening to Ron now, with a faint smile that was partly amusement and partly something more careful. He looked at Ginny, who was not reading her book, and he looked at Molly, who was pouring hot water into a teapot with the steady hands of someone who had made this particular motion thousands of times and intended to make it thousands more. I should leave. The thought arrived fully formed, with a kind of clean, hard logic to it. If he was the reason the Burrow was a target, then the solution to the Burrow being a target was the removal of the reason. He could go tonight, not far, just away, just somewhere that wasn't here, and take whatever attention was currently directed at this house and redirect it towards something that didn't contain the Weasley family. He had his wand. He knew enough disapparition theory to manage it. Or he could walk, just walk out through the garden and into the surrounding area and draw whatever was out there away from the people sitting in this kitchen. He turned this thought over, examined it. It had the shape of nobility, which was the first thing that made him suspicious of it. He had learned this about himself slowly and with some difficulty over the past several years, that the thoughts which arrived with the most convincing shape of sacrifice were frequently the thoughts that deserved the most scrutiny, because they were easy to feel good about without thinking through what they actually accomplished. Leaving would not make the Burrow safer, not necessarily, not if the interest in the Burrow was already established and his departure was noted. Leaving would separate him from the only people who were currently in a position to help him and whom he was in a position to help. Leaving would be if he was honest with himself, and he was trying increasingly to be honest with himself, a way of doing something that felt like action in a situation where there was, right now, no useful action available. Moody would have said, "Don't move when moving doesn't help. Moving helps you feel like you're doing something. Staying and thinking helps you do something." He wasn't sure if Moody had ever said that exactly. It sounded like something Moody would say. He stayed. He thought, "Am I the cause?" This was a different question from the leaving question, and it was harder. The leaving question had a logical structure he could evaluate. This one was murkier, more weighted, the kind of question that didn't have an answer so much as a series of partially satisfying responses, each of which dissolved into the next one. He had not chosen to be born. He had not chosen the prophecy, had not chosen Voldemort's attention, had not chosen any of the first and foundational conditions that had made him what he was in the magical world's understanding of him. He had not brought this to the Weasley family deliberately. He had not recruited them into danger. They had chosen him, each of them in different ways and at different moments, with different degrees of understanding of what they were choosing. Arthur and Molly had known. Harry was increasingly certain, more than they had ever let on, about what taking him in might eventually mean. They were Order members. They were not naive people. The open-door policy toward Harry Potter was not uninformed generosity. It was informed generosity, which was a different thing, a harder thing, the kind that could not be easily dismissed or relieved by guilt or gratitude. So was he the cause. He was a condition. He was a fact of the situation. Whether he was the cause depended on how you allocated responsibility, and Harry had spent enough time in the vicinity of Dumbledore's way of thinking to know that the allocation of responsibility in situations like this one was never as simple as if X had not existed. Y would not have happened. You could trace it back endlessly. You could blame a prophecy, a choice made before he was born, a failure of love in a boy who became a Dark Lord, a war that predated his own arrival in the world. None of this, he found, made him feel better. It was the right kind of thinking, but it did the wrong kind of work, which was to say, it arrived at a reasonable conclusion and left him feeling exactly as responsible as before. He looked at the candle. Harry. He looked up, Molly was standing at the table with a cup of tea, setting it in front of him. She did not sit down, stood for a moment with her hands resting on the back of the chair, looking at him with an expression he recognized from other moments, quieter moments, moments when the kitchen had been empty and she had found him sitting somewhere, thinking thoughts he hadn't told anyone about. "Drink that," she said. "It helps." "With what?" he asked, before he could stop himself. She looked at him for a moment. "With the thinking," she said. "You think better when you're warm." She went back to the counter. Harry looked down at the tea, hot, strong, the way she always made it, and thought, "She knows what I'm doing. She knows I'm sitting here making myself responsible for this." He didn't know how she knew. He suspected it was the same way she knew most things about the people in her kitchen. Not by being told, but by having watched human beings for long enough that their internal weather became legible, visible in the set of shoulders and the angle of a face and the specific quality of stillness that meant someone is carrying something they haven't said yet. He wrapped his hands around the cup. The tea was, in fact, immediately and irritatingly helpful. He thought, if I am a condition rather than a cause, then what does that change about tonight? It changed the leaving question, had already changed it, was the reason he had not moved toward the door. But it also changed, or should change, what he did with the information he had. He was sitting at this table with knowledge that was relevant to their situation. Not complete knowledge, not certainty, but informed suspicion based on things he had heard and learned and carried. And he was sitting on it because he was afraid of adding fear to the room, and afraid of being wrong, and afraid of a third thing he had not yet fully identified. He identified it now, sitting with his hands around the warm cup. He was afraid that if he said what he thought, "This feels deliberate. This feels like reconnaissance. This feels like someone checking whether the house is worth attacking," that it would become real in a way it wasn't quite yet, or in a way that the room's current management of it was successfully preventing. Molly had the situation in a particular kind of equilibrium. One candle, quiet hands on wands, the twins performing normalcy, everyone present and accounted for. That equilibrium was fragile. He could feel how fragile it was. And he was afraid that his voice, his specific voice, saying his specific fear, would break it. Harry Potter thinks someone is out there, specifically, for us, because of him. That was a different thing from the enchantments have gone down, and your father is on his way. It was a different weight, and he sat with the question of whether he had the right to add it to the room, or whether the right decision was the one he was currently making by default. Silence, warmth, the small, reliable presence of someone who was staying put and thinking clearly and not running toward the door. "Ron," Fred said suddenly, with no preamble and no change in posture. "If you had to pick between the Cannons winning the league and, I don't know, a moderately inconvenient hex, which would you? Why would those be the options?" "They're the options I'm offering. That's not how options work." "It's absolutely how options work." Harry almost smiled. Didn't quite, but almost. He looked at Ginny, who was watching Fred with an expression that was approximately 40% amusement and 60% the same careful attention she had been directing at everything all evening. She glanced at Harry. He looked back. Something passed between them that was not a conversation, but was adjacent to one. The acknowledgement, again, that they were both reading the same room and arriving at similar conclusions and keeping those conclusions somewhere quiet while the evening continued around them. Outside, something moved, not loudly, not dramatically. A sound in the garden that could have been the wind returning, could have been an animal, a fox, the garden's long-established gnome population, anything. But that landed differently because of the silence that had preceded it, because of the frogs that had gone quiet, because of the specific attentiveness Harry had developed in the last hour for sounds that came from outside this kitchen. He did not move. Across the table, Ginny's hand had settled beside her wand. Molly had gone very still at the counter. The sound did not repeat. The candle burned, the tea cooled. The night outside the curtained windows held whatever it was holding, patient and uncommitted, not yet resolved into anything that required a response. And Harry sat in the middle of it all and turned over his responsibility like a stone. He still wasn't sure he wanted to look under, and thought about what it meant to carry a thing and what it meant to set it down, and whether those were even different actions, or whether they were just two names for the same impossible negotiation between what you knew and what you owed the people sitting next to you in the dark. He owed them something. He was certain of that much. He was not yet certain what. Fred Weasley stopped mid-sentence. It was not a dramatic stop, not the kind that drew attention, not the kind accompanied by a sharp intake of breath or a sudden change in posture. It was quieter than that, and in some ways more unsettling for its quietness. He had been saying something about the cannons, a follow-up to his question about the hex, building toward what was clearly going to be an elaborate and well-constructed piece of nonsense. And then, between one word and the next, he simply stopped. His eyes moved to the window. The curtained window, dark and unrevealing, giving nothing back. He looked at it for perhaps 2 seconds, maybe 3, and his face in those seconds was not Fred Weasley's face in any of the ways Harry was accustomed to seeing it. It was just a face, just a young man's face, looking at a curtained window in the dark. Then Fred looked back at Ron and said, "Anyway, the point is that the Cannon's management has historically shown all the strategic foresight of a Niffler in a Gringotts vault. So," and he was Fred again, fully and immediately. The performance reassembled so quickly and so completely that if you had blinked, you would have missed the interval entirely. Harry had not blinked. He looked at George and found that George was already looking at him. Not with surprise. George had the air of someone who was rarely surprised by anything he observed, who had simply been waiting for someone else to observe the same thing. He held Harry's gaze for a moment, level and undemonstrative, and then returned his attention to Ron, who was responding to Fred's Niffler analogy with the focused indignation of someone who felt that the Chudley Cannons deserved better representation than they were currently receiving. Harry looked down at his tea. He was thinking about what he had just seen, fitting it in beside the other things he had been accumulating all evening. Molly's face when the light first flickered, the frogs going quiet, the sound in the garden that had not repeated. The list was getting long. It was the kind of list that, if you read it aloud, would sound like the setup to something, the first act of an evening that had not yet revealed what kind of evening it intended to be. Fred had looked at the window and his face had told the truth for 3 seconds before he put the performance back on. This was not a small thing. Harry had known Fred Weasley for 5 years and could count on one hand the number of times he had seen that face. The face underneath, the one that wasn't performing anything. It appeared rarely and briefly, and only in moments when Fred forgot, or when the moment was large enough that forgetting became unavoidable. It had appeared once at the end of 4th year, in the hospital wing, when Fred had stood near the door and looked at the beds and not said anything for almost a full minute. It had appeared once the previous year at Grimmauld Place, late at night, when Harry had come downstairs for water and found Fred sitting alone in the kitchen, with the extendable ear coiled in his hand, not using it, just holding it. And it had appeared tonight, in a curtained kitchen, for 3 seconds, directed at a window that gave nothing back. Harry thought about what that cost, the maintenance of it, the daily and hourly and moment-by-moment upkeep of being Fred Weasley, the jokes, the energy, the absolute refusal to let a room stay heavy. He was increasingly understanding not a personality, but a practice, something chosen and rechosen, continuously, the way you chose to get out of bed on a difficult morning. Not because you felt like it, because someone needed the room to be lighter than it was, and you had the ability to make it lighter, and you had decided, somewhere along the way, that this ability was also an obligation. "Right," George said, leaning back in his chair. "I think what we've established is that Ron's loyalty to the canons is less a sports preference and more a defining aspect of his identity that he's incapable of examining critically, which is actually quite interesting from a psychological—" "Don't," Ron said. "I'm just saying. You're doing the thing where you sound like you're being reasonable. I am being reasonable. But actually, you're just agreeing with Fred. Fred raises valid points. Fred raises—" Ron stopped, apparently unable to complete this sentence in a way that satisfied him, and settled for, "The canons are going to have a good season." "Absolutely," Fred said, with great warmth. "And after that, I fully expect them to invent a new kind of flying and solve the problem of winter." Ginny made the sound that was almost a laugh again. This time, Harry let himself make it too, just slightly, just enough to register. Across the table, Molly set down cups without comment, but her shoulders, Harry thought, dropped perhaps a fraction of a degree. The tea distribution continued. The candle burned. Harry watched Fred refill his own cup and thought, he's doing this for her. Not exclusively, not with a single clear intention, because Fred's relationship with humor was too ingrained and too genuine to be reducible to pure strategy. But tonight, in this kitchen, with this particular darkness outside and this particular silence filling the spaces between sentences, yes, the jokes were for Molly. They were the thing Fred could offer that no protective enchantment could provide, which was the sound of her family being or performing being. All right. Harry thought about what that required. It required you to hold your own fear in a specific way, not suppressing it exactly, because suppression implied force, implied a thing straining against a barrier. It was more like a choice about where to put your attention. You could attend to the fear. You could give it the room, let it take up the space it wanted, let it fill the kitchen the way it was trying to fill the kitchen, with its specific and legitimate weight. Or you could attend instead to the person across the table who needed the room to feel lighter than it was. And in attending to them, in directing your energy outward rather than inward, you did not make the fear smaller. It was still there. It was still accurate. But you made yourself larger than it, if only for the duration of the joke, if only for the length of one sentence about Niffler's and Gringotts' faults. Harry had never thought about courage in quite this way before. He had thought about it in terms of action, of facing things, of moving toward danger rather than away from it, of the particular decision made in a moment of clear and immediate threat. He had less often thought about it as something you could perform in a kitchen, in the dark, without moving from your chair. But watching Fred refill his cup and watching George watch Ron with that careful, measuring attention, the attention of someone checking not just that Ron was all right, but that he continued to be all right, that the all rightness was holding. Harry thought that what was happening at this table was a kind of courage he did not have a good word for. It wasn't bravery, exactly. It wasn't valor. It was something quieter and more domestic and more difficult to sustain. It was also, he realized, something Molly had taught them. He looked at her. She was standing at the counter again, not making anything now, just standing with her hands resting lightly on the surface, and he could see in the set of her that she was listening, not to Fred and George and Ron, or not only to them, but to the house, to the garden, to the dark outside the curtains. She was doing two things simultaneously, and doing both of them completely, and Harry thought that this too was something she had learned or had always known or had become. The capacity to hold the room's lightness and the real situation in her attention at the same time without letting either one collapse the other. "Mum," George said suddenly. Everyone looked at him. The shift in register was immediate. George had used the same voice as before, the lower one, the one he kept for moments when the performance needed to be set down for a moment. Molly turned around. "Is there anything we should be doing?" George asked. "Practically, is there a protocol?" It wasn't quite a question. The inflection was level, matter of fact, and Harry recognized it as the way George asked things when he already had a partial answer and was checking it against someone else's, the way he operated in the shop when he needed to know if a product was safe and wanted a second opinion without revealing the full extent of his concern. Molly looked at him for a moment, then at Fred. Fred was watching her with the same expression as his brother, attentive, level, the performance set aside in a way that said clearly that it could be retrieved immediately if needed, but that right now they needed to talk plainly. "Stay together," Molly said. "Keep your wands close. Don't go near the windows or the doors. Your father will be here within the hour, likely less, and until then, stay together." "And if something happens before that," Fred said. Not as a challenge, as a fact he was requesting confirmation on. "Then we deal with it together," Molly said. "All of us." Fred nodded once. George nodded once. They looked at each other, that brief, fast exchange. And then Fred leaned back in his chair and said to Ron in a completely different voice, "Right, so, back to the cannons. I've been thinking about their keeper situation, and I have some theories." "Oh, for—" Ron began. And the kitchen was doing the thing again, filling itself up, and Harry sat in the middle of it, with his hands around his cooling cup, and felt something shift in his understanding of the evening. He had been watching Fred and George and cataloguing what they were doing, the performance, the courage of it, the choice and re-choice. And he had been watching with a degree of separation, the way you watched something you could see clearly because you were outside it. But he wasn't outside it. He was at this table too. He was one of the people in this kitchen that Fred and George were performing for. And he was one of the people Molly was keeping close and keeping warm with tea. And he had been so occupied with what he was carrying, his responsibility, his information, the stone he kept turning over, that he had not fully accounted for the fact that he was also, tonight, being carried. This landed differently than he expected. He was not accustomed to it, or was accustomed to it, and resistant to the knowledge of being accustomed to it, which was a different thing. The Weasley family had been carrying him in various ways and to various degrees since he was 11 years old, and he had received this with gratitude that was genuine and complete, and that sat alongside a persistent discomfort he had never fully resolved, the discomfort of needing something you hadn't asked for and couldn't reciprocate in kind. But watching Fred tonight, watching the 3 seconds of real face before the performance reassembled, he thought that perhaps the reciprocation wasn't the point. Perhaps the point was simply the table, the being here, the 9 hands on the clock all pointing to home, which meant that the thing the clock measured was not safety exactly, but presence, the presence of the people who mattered, in the place that held them, on a night when the enchantments had gone down and the frogs had stopped, and something outside in the dark had not yet declared itself. He was part of that. He was one of the 9. He had not chosen it initially, but he had stayed. Summer after summer, he had come back to this kitchen, this table, this noise and warmth and the particular chaos of too many Weasleys in too small a space. He had come back because it was the closest thing he had to what this was, and what this was. He looked around the table at Ron's indignation and Fred's grin and George's careful attention and Ginny's almost reading and Molly's still hands at the counter. What this was a family that had decided somewhere along the way that he was part of it. And families, Harry was learning, did not carry each other because the accounting balanced. They carried each other because someone needed carrying, and they could. Harry, Fred, said, with the careful casualness of someone constructing a natural transition, "You've been sitting there, looking thoughtful for about 40 minutes. Either tell us what you're thinking, or join the canon's debate, because the middle ground is getting uncomfortable." Harry looked at him. Fred looked back, easy and open, the performance present but not concealing, more like a frame around something genuine than a cover over something hidden. "I'm fine," Harry said. "Obviously you're not," Fred said, with no particular judgment in it. "But that's all right. None of us are, particularly. The key is to be not fine in an interesting and preferably canons-adjacent way." Harry almost laughed. Did laugh a little, not much, but enough. "The canons," he said, "are not going to have a good season." "Now he joins us," George said, with satisfaction. "Ron, you're outnumbered." "I'm never outnumbered," Ron said. "I'm just ahead of the consensus." And Fred was laughing. Genuinely, this time not performed. And the kitchen was warm with it, and outside the dark garden held its silence, and the candle burned, and Molly turned from the counter with an expression that was not relief, because it was too quiet for relief. But that was something close to it, something in the same family as it, the expression of a woman who had asked her children to stay together and found that they were, and that it was, for now, enough. Harry looked at the clock on the wall. In the candlelight, he could barely make out the hands, but he could see enough. All of them still pointing to the same place, all 9 unwavering. Home, home, home. Ginny had not turned a page in 40 minutes. Harry knew this because he had been watching, not obviously, not with the kind of sustained attention that announced itself, but in the peripheral, habitual way he had developed over the past several hours of watching everything at once and appearing to watch nothing in particular. The book was open in front of her at the same page. It had been open to since supper, the same paragraph, the same few lines that her eyes moved across at intervals without. Harry was reasonably certain, registering any of them. The book was something for her hands to do. The same function as Molly's tea, the same function as Fred's jokes, a prop in the management of the evening. Something that said, I am sitting here calmly reading, without requiring that to actually be true. What Ginny was actually doing was listening. He could see it in the quality of her stillness. It was not the stillness of someone absorbed in a book, that had a particular inward quality, a slight softening of the face, a mild vacancy in the eyes that meant attention had been redirected somewhere internal. Ginny's stillness was the opposite of that. It was outward. Her face was alert in a way that the book-reading posture was supposed to conceal but didn't. Not entirely. Not to someone who was paying attention. Her ears, metaphorically, though Harry sometimes thought her ears were functioning with an almost physical intensity, were directed at the curtained windows, at the door, at the ceiling above which no one was moving because everyone was here, at the garden outside which was still and had been still for over an hour now with the specific, deliberate quality of a held breath. Her wand was on the table beside her right hand. It had been there since the lights went out. She had not moved it, had not picked it up, had not done anything that would draw attention to it. It was simply present, the way a prepared person kept things, not displayed, not hidden, just available, within reach, there if needed, without requiring a moment's search or a second's delay. Harry had noticed this early and had found it, at the time, quietly impressive, and had since found it something more than that, a kind of moral statement, or if not a statement, then a posture, a way of being in the room that said something about how Ginny Weasley had decided to meet this evening. She was not pretending it away. She was not performing calm for the room's benefit, not the way Fred and George were. Not because she was incapable of it, Harry suspected, but because she had decided on a different approach. Where Fred and George made the room lighter, Ginny made herself heavier, more anchored, steadier, a ballast rather than a buoy. Both functions were necessary. Both required choice. He was not sure, watching her, which required more. He thought about the chamber. He did not think about it often. It was Ginny's experience, not his, and he had arrived at the end of it rather than the beginning and had seen only the aftermath, the girl on the floor of that cold stone chamber and the diary and Tom Riddle's voice, and he had not, at 11, fully understood what had been done to her, or what it had taken from her, or what she had had to rebuild in herself afterward. He understood it better now. He understood it as a particular kind of violation, the most intimate kind, the kind that reached inside and rearranged things. And he understood that the person sitting across from him at this kitchen table with her wand at her right hand and her book open to an unread page had come out of that with something that most people did not acquire without cost, and that the cost had been real, and that the thing she had acquired was this: the knowledge that darkness was survivable, not comfortable, not acceptable, not something you had to pretend wasn't there, but survivable if you were prepared, and the preparation was real, and you didn't spend your energy on pretending. It was, Harry thought, an expensive kind of courage to carry. He was not sure he would have come out of it the same way. He was not sure most people would. The candle had burned down by nearly half now. The wax had pooled around the base, and the flame was steady and small, throwing less light than it had an hour ago, the shadows at the edges of the kitchen deeper and more definite. Ron had run out of Cannon's arguments and had settled into a kind of quiet, not uncomfortable, just depleted, the way arguments depleted you even when you believed you were right, perhaps especially then. Fred was doing something with a small piece of parchment, folding it without looking at it, a repetitive motion that Harry recognized as the equivalent of his own candle watching. George had his eyes half closed in a way that suggested either that he was almost asleep or that he was listening very carefully and using the appearance of drowsiness as cover. Molly had sat down. This was recent, the last 10 minutes or so, and Harry had registered it with a kind of relief he hadn't expected. She had sat down at her end of the table, with her hands folded in front of her again, and her wand in her apron pocket, and her face arranged in the expression she used for patience. Not contentment, not quite, but the determined practice of waiting without letting the waiting become its own kind of suffering. The kitchen was quiet, the good kind of quiet, almost, or as close as tonight was going to get to the good kind, the kind where the people in the room had said what needed saying for now and were simply being present with each other, which was, Harry was finding, not nothing. "You've stopped pretending to read," he said quietly. Ginny looked up. She didn't look surprised. Looked, if anything, as though she had been expecting him to say something and had been waiting for him to get there. "You stopped pretending not to watch about 20 minutes ago," she said, equally quietly. "I wasn't—" "You were." She closed the book, set it to one side, picked up her wand, not purposefully, not with any particular intention, and turned it slowly in her fingers, end over end, the way you turned a pen when you were thinking. "What were you watching for?" He considered the question. "I don't know exactly," he said, which was honest. "I think I was trying to understand how you were doing it." "Doing what?" He looked at the wand in her hands, at the easy, unperformative way she held it. "You're not pretending it's fine," he said. "You're not doing what Fred and George are doing, but you're also not—" He paused. "You're not scared. Or you are, but it's not in charge," Ginny said. He looked at her. "That's the thing," she said, not as though she were explaining it to him, but as though she were explaining it to herself, or confirming something she had worked out a while ago and was now checking the articulation of. "Fear is there. It's accurate, I think. I think something is out there tonight. I think you think so too. I think Mum knows it, and Dad's probably been told it by now. The fear is appropriate. I'm just not letting it make the decisions. She turned the wand over once more. It tries to, though. Fear always tries to be the decision maker. It's very pushy about it. Harry thought about the leaving impulse, the clean, hard logic of it that had turned out, on examination, to be fear wearing the costume of nobility. Yes, he said, it is. The chamber. She started, and then stopped, and Harry did not move or speak, understanding that this was a sentence she was deciding whether to finish, and that the decision was hers. She turned the wand over again. In the chamber, fear was the only thing there was for a long time. There was nothing else to attend to, nothing to do, nothing to plan, nothing that would help. So the fear just had everything, all the space, and it does things to you when it has all the space. It becomes very loud. It becomes the thing that's most real. She paused. After, I decided I wasn't going to let it have all the space again. There had to be something else in the room with it. Something I was doing or preparing or thinking about. Something that wasn't the fear itself. Harry looked at the wand in her hands. That's what the wand is, he said. That's what the wand is, she agreed. It's not that I think I could. I mean, if it's actually Death Eaters out there, if they came at the house, I'm not under any illusion that I could. She stopped. But having it out means I'm preparing rather than just waiting. And preparing feels different from waiting. It gives the fear somewhere to put its energy that isn't, she gestured vaguely, eating me. Harry was quiet for a moment. He looked at his own hands, at the wand lying on the table in front of him. He had placed it there sometime in the last hour without really deciding to. Some version of the same instinct. You said you think something's out there, he said. Yes, I think so too. She looked at him steadily. I know, she said. You've been thinking about it since before supper. I saw you in the garden. You saw me. Through the window. You were standing on the step with the listening face. I don't have a listening face. You absolutely have a listening face. It's the one where you go very still and your eyes do something. My eyes don't. Harry, she said with patience, your eyes absolutely do something. He almost smiled. Didn't quite, but it was a near thing, and Ginny's expression acknowledged this without comment. The almost smile faded, and they were quiet for a moment, both of them looking at the curtained window, both of them listening. Do you think they'll come at the house? Harry asked. He asked it quietly, not because he was afraid of being overheard. The others were far enough away, and the ongoing murmur of Fred's parchment folding and Ron's occasional contribution to a conversation that had largely wound down provided sufficient cover, but because it felt like the kind of question that wanted a quiet register. Ginny considered it. I think, she said carefully, that if they were going to come at the house directly, they'd have done it when the enchantments first went down. The window was biggest then. It's been over an hour. She paused. I think tonight is about something else. Reconnaissance, Harry said. She looked at him. You heard that at order meetings. I heard a lot of things at order meetings. They should have just let you in, she said, with a flatness that suggested this was a long-held opinion rather than a fresh one. Half the things they tried to keep from you ended up happening to you anyway. The secrecy just meant you were underprepared. Harry didn't answer this, partly because he agreed, and partly because agreeing felt disloyal to Dumbledore in a way he wasn't prepared to navigate tonight, and partly because there was something else he wanted to say, something that had been sitting at the back of his thinking all evening, behind the leaving impulse and the responsibility question, and the list of things he had been accumulating, something quieter and more fundamental that he had been approaching gradually and was only now close enough to say, "They're here because of me," he said. Ginny did not react with surprise, did not react initially in any visible way, just continued turning the wand in her fingers end over end, the motion steady and unchanged. Then she said, "Maybe." "Not maybe," he said. "The burrow is a target because—" "I know why the burrow is a target," she said, and her voice was not sharp, but it was definite, the voice of someone declining to be managed. "I've known for a long time. We all have. Mum and Dad have always known." She looked at him. "That doesn't make it your fault. It makes it my condition," she said, surprising him. "It makes it a condition, not a fault. Fault implies you chose it, or that you could have done differently. You couldn't have. You didn't." She looked back at the window. "None of us chose the war, Harry. We're all just in it." He sat with this. It was not, he noticed, different from the conclusion he had reached. Himself, the condition not cause reasoning. He had worked through over the candle earlier in the evening, but it landed differently coming from her. Not because her logic was superior, it wasn't. It was essentially the same logic, but because she had arrived at it from the other side. He had been working through his own responsibility. She had been living with the target. "Does it bother you?" he asked. "That I—" "No," she said, immediately and without apparent need for consideration. Then, slightly more carefully, "Sometimes I wish things were different. Not you, not this. Just the war, the fact of it. The way it puts everyone I care about in the path of something that—" She stopped, started again. "But that's not the same as it bothering me. That you're here." She glanced at him, brief and direct. "Your family, Harry. Family doesn't get to be someone else's fault." Harry looked at the clock on the wall in the diminished candlelight. He could barely make it out, just the shape of it, the 9 hands, all pointing the same direction. "Home, you feel it too," he said, "don't you? Right now, that something's changed." She was quiet for a moment. The wand stilled in her fingers, not stopped, just slowed, the rotation becoming smaller and slower until it was almost nothing. "Yes," she said. Outside, a sound, small, directionless, gone before Harry could locate it. Ginny's hand closed around her wand. Not raised, not tensed, just closed. A quiet, complete grip. The grip of someone who had decided some time ago how they were going to hold difficult things and was holding them now exactly that way. Harry looked at her hand around the wand and thought about everything she had said, about fear and the space you gave it, about preparation as a form of courage, about family and fault and the difference between them. He picked up his own wand. He held it the same way. Not raised, not tensed, just present, just there. Ginny glanced at his hand and then away, and her expression did something brief and undemonstrative that Harry thought was, as close as Ginny Weasley got to it tonight, a kind of relief. They sat in the diminished candlelight and listened, together, to the dark. The candle was nearly gone. Not gone, not yet, but close enough that the flame had taken on the particular character of flames near their end, burning lower and less steadily than before, casting light that moved more than it held still, throwing shadows that shifted at the edges of the kitchen in a way that made the room feel less fixed, less certain of its own dimensions. Harry had been watching it burn all evening in the way you watched something that was marking time, and now it was marking very little time indeed, and the kitchen felt smaller for it. Arthur had not yet arrived. Molly had not said anything about this, had not checked the clock, or had not appeared to check the clock, which Harry suspected was the result of effort rather than indifference. She was sitting at the head of the table with her hands folded and her face arranged and her wand in her apron pocket. And she had been sitting this way for the better part of an hour, and Harry watched her and thought that the maintenance of that composure was one of the more demanding things he had witnessed tonight, and tonight had contained several demanding things. Ron had fallen asleep. This had happened gradually and then completely, the way Ron's sleep always happened, a slow decrease in conversational contribution, a slight forward movement of the head, and then simply asleep, chin nearly on his chest, breathing steadily. Fred had noticed first and had said nothing, which was its own kind of consideration. George had moved Ron's teacup slightly further from the edge of the table without waking him, a motion so practiced and unself-conscious it was clearly not the first time. Fred was still folding his piece of parchment. The shape it had become was indeterminate, not a recognizable object, just a series of accumulated folds, something that had started as flat and become complicated through inattention and repetition. He set it down, looked at it, picked it up again. Ginny was at Harry's left, her wand still in her hand, her book closed and set aside. She was not sleeping and was not going to sleep. Harry understood this with certainty and was not pretending to do anything other than what she was doing, which was sitting with her wand in her hand and her attention directed at the darkness outside the curtains. The kitchen held all of this: the nearly gone candle, the sleeping Ron, the folded parchment, the steady, practiced composure of Molly Weasley at the head of the table. Harry looked at Molly and thought about everything he had decided not to say tonight, and about the weight of having decided it, and about whether the decision still held. He had thought earlier that saying what he knew, that the suppression felt deliberate, that this had the texture of reconnaissance, would break something in the room's equilibrium, would add a specific and named fear to something that was currently being managed as a general and unnamed one. He had thought that Molly had the situation in hand, and that his information, being speculative, would do more harm than good. He had thought several things, and had held them in the way you held things you were not yet ready to set down. But the candle was nearly gone. Arthur had not arrived. The garden outside had been silent for over an hour with the held breath quality that Harry's body had been reading as significant all evening, and he was tired, not sleepy, nothing like sleepy, but tired in the way that came from carrying something heavy for a long time without putting it down. He looked at Molly. She was already looking at him, not with the checking expression she used for the others, not the head count look, the "are my people present" look. Something more direct than that. Something that had been waiting for him to look back at it, and when he did, it did not look away. Harry said quietly, "Can I need to say something." Fred looked up from the parchment. George's half-closed eyes opened fully. Ginny, at his left, did not move, but he felt her attention shift toward him. "Of course," Molly said. Her voice was the voice she used for the real things, not warm exactly, not the supper table voice, but steady and receiving, the voice that said, "Say it, and I will hear it." Harry put his hands flat on the table. He looked at them for a moment, both hands, wand on the table beside the right one, and then looked up at Molly and said, "I think this is deliberate. Tonight, the enchantment's going down. I think something out there suppressed them intentionally. I heard Moody talking about it at Grimmauld Place. A fast, clean suppression is different from a gradual failure. It means proximity, but it also means intent." He paused. "I think someone is out there specifically, not passing through. I think tonight is about finding out what's here, how protected it is, whether it's worth—" He stopped. The kitchen was very quiet. Molly looked at him for a long moment. The candle flame moved and steadied and moved again. Then she said, "I know, Harry." He had expected this, had almost expected it, and yet it arrived with a weight he had not fully prepared for. Not relief, not exactly. Something that needed a moment to settle. "You know," he said. "Yes." "How long?" "Since before the lights went out," she said. "Since the first flicker." She looked at him steadily. "I recognized it, the way it felt, the quality of it. Arthur and we've discussed what this would feel like if it happened. We've discussed it more than once." A pause. "I had hoped we were wrong. I spent approximately 90 seconds hoping that very thoroughly. And then I lit the candle." Harry sat with this. "You didn't say." "No." "Why?" She was quiet for a moment, and in that moment, Fred set down the parchment, and George sat forward, and Ginny's hand tightened slightly around her wand, and all of them were waiting, and Molly looked at the candle flame, and then at Harry and said, "Because knowing what it is doesn't change what we do about it. We stay together. We wait for Arthur. We keep our wands close. We don't go near the windows." She paused. "Naming it doesn't make us safer. It just makes it louder. And I needed this kitchen to stay manageable." Another pause. "For them." Her eyes moved briefly to Ron, asleep, and to Fred and George, and something passed through her face that was too complicated and too large to name in a single word. Love, certainly, but love tangled up with something fiercer, something that had the quality of a decision made long ago and lived with ever since. Harry looked at her. "But you also knew that I knew," he said, "or suspected. You've known. Since supper." "Yes." "And you didn't tell me either." She looked at him, and he thought he saw, for just a moment, the thing she was carrying, the real weight of it underneath the composure, the thing that the folded hands and the steady voice were containing. "No," she said. "I didn't." "Why?" The candle flame moved. The shadows shifted. "Because," Molly said, slowly, as though arriving at the words as she said them, rather than retrieving them from somewhere prepared. "You carry enough. You carry more than enough. And you carry most of it alone. And I have watched you sit at this table all evening and add tonight to the pile of things you are carrying. And She stopped, started again, more quietly. "I have been a mother for a long time, Harry. And one of the things that means is that you sometimes protect people from knowledge that would only hurt them without helping them. And one of the things it also means is that you get that calculation wrong sometimes. You protect people from things they actually needed to know, or that they had a right to know, and you think you're doing it for them, but you're also doing it for yourself, because knowing that they know makes it more real, and more real is harder. Harry was very still. "So I don't know," she said, "whether I didn't tell you because it was better for you or because it was easier for me. I think it was probably both. I think most of the hard decisions are both." The kitchen was entirely quiet. Even the candles seemed to be listening. Fred said, very quietly, "Mum." She looked at him. "We know," he said. "We've both known since you drew the curtains." She looked at Fred. She looked at George. George nodded once, the same single nod he had given after the question about protocol, the nod that was confirmation rather than response. "I know you knew," Molly said. "You've always been. You notice things, both of you. You always have." Her voice changed on this in a way that Harry hadn't heard before. Not breaking, nothing so dramatic, but shifting register, moving from the composed and steady voice to something older and quieter underneath it. "Your father and I always said, you notice everything and say nothing, and we could never decide whether that was a skill or a burden." "Both," George said, with a faint trace of the familiar tone. "Just a trace, nothing more. Turns out it's both." Molly looked at him for a moment, and then she made a sound that was almost a laugh, small and brief and complicated, and pressed her hand briefly over her eyes in a gesture Harry had never seen her make before. Then she lowered her hand, and she was Molly again, composed, present, steady. But the composition was different now, somehow less effortful, as though something that had been held tight had been let go a small degree, enough to make the holding easier. "Right," she said. "Well, now we all know." "And nothing changes," Ginny said. "Not a question." "And nothing changes," Molly confirmed. "We stay, we wait, we keep our wands close." Harry looked at the clock. In the dying candlelight, he could see the hands, all of them, pointing home. "He's close," Molly said, following his gaze. "I can feel it when he's close. It's a—" She paused, and something moved across her face that was entirely private and not meant for the room. "It's a particular kind of knowing, after this many years. Outside, a sound. Not the tentative, directionless sound from earlier. Something more definite. Footsteps, specific and deliberate, coming around the side of the house, and a voice, low and immediate. Molly. Molly was on her feet before anyone else moved. "Arthur," she said, not loudly, not calling out, just saying it, just the name, the way you said the name of something you'd been waiting for long enough that saying it felt like its own kind of relief. The back door opened, and Arthur Weasley came in from the dark. He was still in his ministry robes, his hair disordered, his face carrying the particular expression of someone who had moved quickly and with purpose and had been afraid during the moving, and who was now here and was setting the fear down visibly in the way that you set things down when you arrived somewhere safe. He took in the kitchen, the candle, the curtains, the wands, Ron asleep, Harry and Ginny, and Fred and George at the table, and something in his face resolved. "Everyone's here," he said. "Everyone's here," Molly confirmed. He crossed the kitchen and she met him halfway, and the moment between them was brief and quiet, and entirely their own, and Harry looked away from it, not out of discomfort, but out of the feeling that it was not his to watch, that it belonged to something longer and more private than tonight, to 20-odd years of exactly this: the return and the relief and the particular way two people who had chosen each other held each other in difficult moments. He looked at Fred instead. Fred was looking at his parents with an expression that was not performed at all, just open, just his own face, just the thing underneath. And it was a younger face than the one Fred usually wore, a softer one, and it lasted only a few seconds before Fred noticed Harry looking and arranged something more characteristic over it, not quickly, but not slowly either. "You all right?" Fred said to Harry. "Yes," Harry said. "Good." Harry looked at the clock. All 9 hands still pointing home. All 9 unchanged. In the last guttering light of the nearly gone candle, the clock face was barely visible, but the hands were there. He could make them out, just, and they were pointing where they had been pointing all evening, to the flicker and the darkness and the held breath of the garden and the weight of what everyone at this table had known and chosen not to say and then said. The candle went out. In the brief darkness before Arthur cast a quiet lumos, and the kitchen filled again with light. Harry sat in the dark and thought, "I told her, and she already knew. And the knowing is out in the room now, and nothing attacked, and everyone is here, and the clock still says home." It was not comfort exactly, but it was something. Dawn came into the burrow the way it always did, gradually, and then all at once. First, just the quality of the darkness changing, a slow dilution of black into grey at the edges of the curtains, light arriving not as an event, but as a process, the world outside remembering itself incrementally. Then the birds, not many, just a few, the early ones, the ones that seemed to have made a private arrangement with the morning to announce it before anyone else was ready. Then, finally, the colour, the kitchen resolving out of its grey uncertainty into the familiar particularity of itself. The mismatched cups, the cluttered counter, the clock on the wall with its 9 hands, the table where 4 people had sat through the night, and 2 of them were now asleep. Fred and George had gone at some point in the small hours. Not to bed exactly, just to the living room, the sofa, horizontal without ceremony, still in their clothes. Ron had not moved. He was still at the kitchen table, still in his chair, tilted at an angle that would cost him something in his neck when he woke. And Harry had looked at him several times during the night with the particular mix of affection and envy that Ron's capacity for sleep always produced in him. Harry had not slept. He was not certain Molly had either. She was at the stove again. Of course, she was at the stove again. This was where mornings found her. This was her natural position at the beginning of things. And she was making something that smelled of eggs and butter and the specific warmth of a kitchen that had been dark and was now light again. Arthur was at the table with a cup of tea and the previous day's prophet, which he was reading with the focused attention of a man who needed something ordinary to do with his eyes. Ginny was gone. Harry had heard her go upstairs sometime around 3, her footsteps quiet on the stairs, and had not heard her come back down. He hoped she was sleeping. She had earned it. Harry sat in the same chair he had occupied all night. He was aware of being tired in a way that was located less in his body than in some deeper layer of himself. Not exhausted exactly, but emptied, the way you felt after something had moved through you and left you unchanged in all the external ways and changed in some internal one that you could feel but not yet name. The kitchen was bright now, the curtains still drawn, but the light coming through them, and the enchantments. Arthur had confirmed this last night, quietly, in the kitchen doorway, had returned sometime around 2 in the morning. Not fully, not with the completeness they had carried before, but returned, present, the hum re-established beneath the ordinary sounds of the house, and Harry had felt it come back the way you felt, warmth returned to a cold hand, slowly and then all at once, and had said nothing about it because it had not seemed like something that needed words. He thought about what Molly had said. Most of the hard decisions are both for them and for you, both protection and self-protection, both the right thing and the easier thing, blurred together in ways that made it impossible, after a certain point, to separate them cleanly. He had been trying, all night in the quiet hours, to decide how he felt about the fact that she had known from the first flicker, and had lit one candle and sent her Patronus to Arthur and sat her family down, and had not said, had chosen the equilibrium of the kitchen over the full truth of the situation, had made the calculation, and arrived at not yet, not until it helps, and had carried it alone until he had said it first. He had expected to feel he wasn't sure. Managed, perhaps. Kept outside, something. The way he sometimes felt when the order discussed things in closed rooms and he was left on the stairs. He did not feel that. What he felt was something quieter and less comfortable and more true, that Molly's calculation had not been different from his own. He had sat at this table all evening making the same decision. Does saying this help, or does it only name the fear and make it larger? And had arrived repeatedly at not yet. They had been making the same calculation from different positions at the same table, both of them carrying the same knowledge and making the same choice with it, and neither of them had known the other was doing it until he had finally spoken and she had said, "I know," and the thing that had been held by two people separately had become, briefly, a thing held together. He was not sure that was better or worse. He thought it was just what it was, what it meant to be in a situation like this one, where the information was real and the threat was real and the people around you were real and you loved them and could not protect them from all of it and had to choose, constantly, how much of the weight to distribute and how much to keep. He looked at Arthur across the table. Arthur was still reading the prophet, or still looking at it, and his face had the expression of a man who had come home in the dark to a lit kitchen and found everyone present and was still, 12 hours later, quietly glad of it. He looked up and met Harry's eyes and nodded, once in a way that communicated something Harry received but could not have translated into words. He nodded back. Molly set a plate in front of Ron, who woke with a start, looked around the kitchen with brief wild disorientation, and then settled back into himself as the familiar smell reached him. "Breakfast," he said, with satisfaction, as though this resolved several questions at once. "Breakfast," Molly confirmed. She set a plate in front of Harry. He looked at it, eggs, toast, the marmalade she knew he liked, and then looked up at her. She was already moving back to the stove. She did not meet his eyes. She did not need to. Harry thought, she's been making this breakfast his whole life, before she knew him, the version of it that was always ready for whoever needed it. He thought about what Ginny had said. "Your family, Harry. Family doesn't get to be someone else's fault, and thought about what that meant in the morning, in the light, after a night spent sitting at a table with people who had chosen each other and him, and who had carried, each of them, more than they had said. He picked up his fork. He ate. Outside, the garden had returned to itself. The frogs were back. He could hear them, distantly, in the warmth that was already building as the morning came fully into itself. The grass would be wet with dew, and the gnomes would be doing whatever gnomes did in the early morning, and the enchantments were present, though diminished, and somewhere beyond the fields the war continued, unchanged and unresolved, as it had been yesterday and would be tomorrow. The burrow was still standing. He thought about that, not with relief exactly, because relief implied the danger had passed, and he was not certain it had, was not certain it would for a long time yet, but with something, some recognition of the fact that the house was standing and the people in it were present, and the clock on the wall said home across all 9 hands, and the breakfast was warm and the morning had come. He thought about safety, about how he had felt the hum of the enchantments all summer without noting it, had moved through this house and this kitchen and this family's particular warmth without stopping to account for any of it. The way you moved through things that worked until they stopped working and you understood, in the stopping, what you had been given. He would not make that mistake again. Not that he could hold on to it permanently. Awareness faded. That was its nature. The ordinary became ordinary again, and the invisible protections became invisible again, and you moved through your days as though the warmth was simply there. But for now, this morning, he knew it. He could feel it. The hum of the re-established enchantments, the warmth of the kitchen, the presence of the people in it, and he let himself feel it without looking away from what it had cost, what it continued to cost, the daily and nightly and moment-by-moment work of people who had decided that this house and these lives were worth protecting. Molly was at the stove. Harry did not thank her. He did not say anything. There was nothing this morning that needed to be said. It had been said, the important part of it, in the candlelight of the small hours with the garden silent outside. And what remained now was not words, but the simple fact of being here and continuing to be here and eating the breakfast that had been made and letting that be what it was. The clock on the wall read, home. All 9 hands, steady and unchanged, pointing to the same place they had pointed all night. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked back at his plate. He finished his breakfast. The enchantments came back fully by noon. Harry felt it happen, standing in the garden with Ron, doing nothing in particular, just standing in the sun with the grass wet under their shoes. A quiet return of that familiar hum, deeper and more complete than the partial restoration of the small hours. Like a held breath, finally released, like a word finally said. He did not mention it to Ron. Ron had slept through most of it, and Harry found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he did not resent this. Some nights were carried by the people who stayed awake through them, and some nights were survived by the people who slept, and both were necessary, and neither chose which they were. He looked back at the burrow, at the crooked, impossible, entirely impractical house that had been extended and enchanted and loved into its current shape over decades of exactly this. People staying and returning and choosing, morning after morning, to be here. It was not safe, It had never been simply safe. It was something harder than that, and more durable. He turned back toward the house,